To our next session now, I will invite to open up the core topics of our conference, Resilience and Innovation. We're delighted to be joined by a panel of experts in the fields led and moderated by Air Vice Marshal retired John Blackburn. Air Vice Marshal Blackburn is a former Deputy Chief of Air Force, current Chairman of the Institute for the Integrated Economic Research, and a member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, amongst other roles. He's a highly respected commentator on energy security and advocate for fuel security and innovation. I'll now pass over to Air Vice Marshal Blackburn. Thank you.
Thank you. Service chiefs, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, and of course, aviators. We live in interesting times. Our session this morning, we're going to discuss resilience in both Australia's context and regionally, and innovation. But we have a few complex problems that we're dealing with today. Here we are 2 years into this decade, and it feels a lot more like 10. So what are we seeing happening at the moment? The pandemic has exposed a global lack of resilience caused by a collective failure to assess and act on national risks and vulnerabilities, particularly in Western nations. We did not prepare. Go back to the start of the decade, bushfires, then floods, and what's been happening now in the last month, particularly in northern New South Wales and South Queensland. And here I'm going to quote from Air Chief Marshal Binskin in his role with Bushfire Royal Commission. Unprecedented is not a reason to be unprepared. We need to be prepared for the future. Of course, that applies completely to the pandemic. But wait, there's more. And now we have the war in Ukraine, highlighting significant resilience issues and, again, preparedness concerns. But if anybody thinks that we're back end of COVID, things are going to get sorted, hopefully eventually, I have some depressing news, because the economic impacts of the pandemic have accelerated problems in global economy that we were anticipating in the next decade, where you think where debt has gone, the fragility of the global economy. Add to that climate change, which is not linear, it will accelerate, and now conflict. I think the biggest risk that we're going to face in this next decade is economic, where a crisis has the risk of becoming a catastrophe. And we have to understand that and prepare for it. You can't wait to react to some of these scenarios or risks that are approaching us. So, what do we see in the news? Discussions about, again, Chief Marshal Binskin, Royal Commission there, but dams are going to boost resilience. We're going to put billions of dollars into national resilience. I love what the Irish Times has said. Does anyone actually know what this means? The government hand down a budget focused on resilience. Look, dollars and budget are critical, but that's not going to build our resilience by itself. It takes leadership, it takes people. There's so much more. It takes, in Australia, a bit of a cultural change. I did find something on the Singapore Facebook site that I thought was quite interesting. When they were talking about this, it was a scam alert for a fake resilience budget scam. But look at the date, March 2020. So who is more prepared than everybody else? The scammers. They moved in very quickly. The other thing that happens in these sort of crises is everything gets labelled resilience. And I particularly want to reflect on the Howard Springs mining camp in the Northern Territory for our foreign visitors. That became a quarantine centre because it made a lot of sense, its layout, its isolation. But someone with either a sense of humour or lacking understanding renamed it the National Centre for Resilience, or a Centre for National Resilience. But it was an award winner. One media group awarded it as the worst word or phrase for 2021. We've got to be serious about resilience, but don't overuse it. On the positive side, there's some fantastic work's been going on in this country. This report from the Department of Home Affairs in 2018 about profiling our vulnerability. We can't address our resilience if we don't understand what our risks and vulnerabilities are, and if we're not honest about them. This was led by EMA Mark Crossweiler and also co-led by Dr. Russ Wise from CSIRO. They came out with a list of what makes us vulnerable. This is 2018. Have a look at that and think about what happened in the bushfires, what's happening in the floods, what's happening in the pandemic. We understand our vulnerabilities that are significant, particularly our import dependencies. But did we act on this and think about doing something? No, we didn't. There's other really good work happening in the community today. The Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience has got some fantastic work. It's networking across the country trying to look at it. And in reaction to the bushfires, We've now got an Australian government agency, National Recovery and Resilience. One slight problem, all of this, including the terms of reference for the Home Affairs report, was about natural disasters. Putin is not a natural disaster. He's an unnatural one. And therefore, we have to expand our thinking that we don't just say natural disasters, bushfires and floods, because to my mind, that's not natural anyway. We have to look at the whole risks and vulnerabilities we're facing as a nation. For the past 2.5 years, I've been running a national resilience project. We've had about 250 people involved from all areas of society, from the healthcare sector to energy, to industry, to academia, and including sociologists, people looking at trust and issues within our society. We tried to answer these three questions. I'll come back with some more detail after our speakers have been through this morning. But what we did is we tried to look at the various parts of our society and ask, are we resilient? Those three questions. But more importantly, how are each of these areas connected? Because we live in a complex world and you can't fix problems by just looking at pieces. So we produce reports on each of these, but the first thing, which is pretty obvious, it looks really nice when you've got a jigsaw, but we don't work that way in Australia. This is how it looks. There are overlaps between these areas. There are no coherent linkage policies or strategies. And that's why, with an industrial age federal political model, we have a huge amount of difficulty in dealing with some of these problems. We produced a report that integrates all the individual ones, and you can tell from the title of this what we think. Australia, a complacent nation, our reactions are too little, too late, and too short-sighted. We have to pay attention to where we are today. The definition of resilience we started with in the project comes from the United Nations Organisation for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I'll let you read that. It's a pretty good definition. It addresses a lot of the issues that it's not going back to business as usual, because that doesn't exist for any of us anymore. It's business as was. As we try and work our way through the challenges we're facing, we're not going back there. It's impossible. But it's still not enough. And again, picking up on the statements that Binny made. Purely reacting to a crisis is not enough. We have to prepare and mobilise our society ahead of time in an attempt to stop a problem become a crisis and a crisis becoming a catastrophe. But again, the other point here is resilience is not just about us. During our project, we spent a fair bit of time talking with the New Zealand government, New Zealand industry and New Zealand Defence and said, how do we think about resilience as a team? For example, us working with New Zealand, looking at the Pacific Island problems and challenges. How do we work together? How would we work with Indonesia? There is no point in us looking after our resilience as a nation in isolation if our neighbours are not resilient, if our region is not resilient. And that requires a bit of a rethink. I asked the New Zealand government, what approach have you had from the Australian government on this? And the answer was none. It's about preparedness and mobilisation. A language that is common within defence, but is almost absent in civil society prior to the pandemic. So these are some pretty important things. So with that early scene set, I'll come back and talk a little bit about what did we find in these results and how RAF's Plan Jericho actually fundamentally influenced this study that we've done over the last 2 years. So with that, I'll now invite Dr. Gibson to the stage to give us his perspectives.